Welcome everyone to Trans-Strategic Dialogue on Energy, OPEC, and the Future of the Global Energy Order. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, welcome to this new intellectual symposium held as part of the Trans-Strategic Dialogue series, a series that since its inception has established a high standard in analysis and foresight. Today, we convene for a new session that reflects the sustained institutional research commitments of Trans Research and Advisory, addressing through research, analysis, and in-depth discussions one of the most complex and influential international issues, global energy and the future of OPEC amid an international order overflowing with transformation. Energy has never merely been an economic commodity. Rather, it is fundamentally a strategic instrument, a means of influence and a factor shaping international balances. At a time when competition among major and regional powers is intensifying and the effectiveness of multilateral systems is declining, the global energy systems find itself facing unprecedented tests where considerations of security and economics intersects with the pressures of climate transition and the demands of development. The current landscape of oil and gas markets reveal profound structural transformations to the extent that neither traditional equations nor conventional frameworks are any longer capable on their own of absorbing these changes or predicting future trajectories. On one hand, OPEC and OPEC Plus face fundamental challenges threatening not only their continuity, but even their very existence. Amid conflicting pressures combining the national interest of member states, fluctuation in global demand, competition from shale oil producers, and efforts to displace fossil fuels from the global energy system. On the other hand, new energy systems are emerging across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, reshaping the map of production, consumption, and the direction of surplus and deficits. A world consuming nearly 100 million barrels of oil per day, while investment in energy transition continue to accelerate, is a world that now more than ever requires reconsideration of energy production and consumption models, alongside comprehensive restructuring of logistics, exports, and the pricing policies associated with them. Therefore, a number of fundamental questions arise in this context, questions that can no longer be postponed. Indeed, this may be the most appropriate time to address them. Is OPEC still capable of playing the role of an effective regulator of global market amid such complexities? What role will be producing countries play in shaping the contours of the new energy order? How can energy security considerations be balanced with the requirements of transitioning towards clean energy? And what lies ahead for countries whose economies depend primarily on hydrocarbon revenues? This dialogue comes at a highly significant moment as multiple factors converge seamlessly from the continuation of geopolitical tension in the Middle East and their repercussions on energy transit routes, and attempts by regional powers to instrumentalize the energy file, to the rising ambition of China and India to secure their energy needs, in addition to Europe's accelerating effort to diversify its supply sources, as well as mounting pressure imposed by climate agreements on existing energy models. The United Arab Emirates, with its vital position within the global energy system and as a leading state in economic diversification and investment in renewable energy sources, is closely monitoring these transformation and actively contributing to shaping the future energy order through its clean energy initiatives, production policies, and strategic partnerships with influential international actors. From this perspective, this dialogue becomes not only an intellectual necessity, but also an academic imperative. Building coherent analytical visions regarding the future of energy constitute a fundamental condition for any successful national policy or regional strategy at a time when the world itself is being reshaped. Thank you for your attendance, and we look forward to a rich discussion that contributes to eliminating future pathways and building a shared understanding of this very important stage in the evolution of global energy order. I would like to first begin with introducing our speakers today. We have with us His Excellency Dr. Adnan Shahabuddin, former Acting Secretary General and Director of Research at the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, and Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. We have with us also Professor Paul J. Stevens, Emeritus Professor at the University of Dundee and Associate Fellow at the Environment and Society Center, Chatham House. We have with us Dr. Carol Nuckley, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Crystal Energy United Kingdom and Secretary General of the Arab Energy Club. Last but not least, we have with us Mr. Robin Mills, CEO of Qamar Energy, United Arab Emirates, and non-resident fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, Columbia University. We will start the dialogue today with His Excellency Dr. Adnan. Dr. Adnan, do you believe the UAE's exit from OPEC will fundamentally affect the organization's ability to balance global oil markets?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Moza, and I'm very pleased, of course, to be with you. And in answer to your question, to be very brief, there is no doubt the United Arab Emirates is a very important, a large producer. So the fact that it decided for its own declared interest, as we have learned, would make it somewhat a bit more difficult to manage the market on the part of OPEC. But I don't think this reflects some of what's being said, that this would mean the OPEC will collapse or not be able to manage the market. I think I described the exit of the United Arab Emirates from OPEC more like a divorce. After 6 decades of partnership, uh, partners evolve, and but what combined them to have common interest did not disappear, does not disappear. Managing the market, maximizing their interest. What happened in the case of the UAE, as it said that it's trying to follow its strategy and to be able to execute its strategy without the strict consideration that OPEC membership obliges it to do. But I think after some period of adjustment, what bind OPEC and UAE, now I say UAE and OPEC because UAE is out as of May 1st, I think there are a lot of the old things that held them together will still be there. And OPEC will still have members that their strategic interest still is to manage the market in a way to stabilize the market on one hand and to maximize the long-term interest of the members while at the same time providing supplies to the user. Yes, to some extent, it's going to be at least immediately, not now, because now we have a war. We don't have any supplies coming out of the Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. But after the Strait of Hormuz opens and we make the adjustment, it will be somewhat more difficult. The Emirate, if it goes ahead with providing 1 million barrels extra from its expansion in upstream, it will make it a bit more difficult. But I think we will see ultimately some partnership, some coordination taking place. I'll stop here, and I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. And we'll get into more details in a bit. I will move to Professor Paul. Do you believe that OPEC's future effectiveness as a global price setter will decline? If so, what role will the organization play in global oil markets?
Okay, in order to sort of give my views, I need to provide a little bit of context. And that context is my view of what the role of OPEC was. The key point here is for the last 100 years, the international oil market has faced a fundamental challenge. And that challenge is the existence of low-cost Middle East oil threatening intense competition between suppliers, leading to a downward pressure on prices. And this has always required some control over production and prices. And there's a long history of such control. In the 1920s, the oil market faced very intense competition between the so-called Seven Sisters, who were the ones that were effectively running the show then. And the result of the intense competition was that prices were falling. In 1928, the major oil companies got together at a Scottish castle called Achnacarry, and between them stitched up the international oil market based upon what was known as the Gulf Basin Point pricing system. In other words, it linked the international price to the US domestic price. In 1944, that system was extended and the Abadan refinery in Iran was added as a basing point. Now, the significance of that was that it effectively opened up the world oil market to cheap Middle East oil in a relatively stable way. And this effectively led to what became known as the OECD economic miracle in the 1950s and 1960s. In the 1950s and 60s, the United Nations started to promote something called the permanent sovereignty over natural resources. And it basically was encouraging producer governments to take more control over their own activities. This basically led to the major oil companies, private companies, being taken over by the producer governments. And effectively, this then brought OPEC into the frame. And OPEC took over the role of controlling price and controlling production in order to stabilize the market. The degree of success they had varied. Sometimes they were very successful, sometimes not so. But the key point here I want to make, and this is very relevant for later discussion, is if OPEC hadn't existed, somebody would have had to invent it. Because unless OPEC existed, then the world oil market would have faced intense competition and declining prices in the same way it did in the 1920s. The reason for this is, in a competitive market, the oil price would be set by the marginal production cost of crude oil. In the 1970s, this was probably less than $2 a barrel at a time in the 70s when the average actual price was $11 to $12 a barrel. The marginal cost of producing crude oil at the moment is debatable. I would put it somewhere between $20 and $50 a barrel, which is a lot lower than the price at the moment, and even the price before Operation Epic Farce, thanks to President Trump, pushed the oil price up. Now, the implication of this is, if more people decide to leave OPEC, and I suspect that they may well do so, then it's going to be increasingly difficult to maintain that control. And this is going to be aggravated because we're in the process of an energy transition which is speeding up. And the reason it's speeding up is because security of energy supply has moved back up the agenda in a lot of consumer countries. I'm old enough to remember the oil shocks of the 1970s and the aftermath on energy policy in consumers of those oil shocks. Operation Epic Farce has produced the same thing here, and we are going to see the same sort of process of consumer governments moving away from fossil fuels, in other words, speeding up the energy transition. One consequence of this will be that the pain of controlling the market, which has fallen to OPEC, is going to get greater, which is why I think that more OPEC members are likely to leave. I'll stop at that point and let others come in.
Thank you, Professor Paul. We're gonna move to Dr. Carol. Dr. Carol, in a recent interview, you noted that the Iran war has coincided with the UAE's departure from OPEC. Could you elaborate on why you believe the post-war reality of the global energy landscape will be fundamentally different and why a return to normal is highly unlikely?
Thank you very much for this invitation to join you and to be on the same panel as Dr. Adnan and Professor Stevens, both of them colleagues I've known for a long time and also very good friends. Well, first of all, I just want to highlight one thing. When you said coincided, I doubt it was a coincidence. I think it would be very unusual to have this kind of major move at such a time and see it as a coincidence. On the contrary, I see that the timing, first of all, it's not a decision that the UAE decision was taken lightly and overnight. It has been the product of many ongoing things, many layers of things that go back to several years. And then the timing proved to be right to do it now when the market will barely take notice because they are focused on something else. So the disruption to the market at the moment was pretty small. So that's why I'm not sure whether coincidence is the right word. Now, my point about going back to normal, because since the war started and the conflict started in the Middle East, I have given so many interviews, and each time almost I'm asked, when do we go back to normal, to the pre-war level? And my response is always like, define to me normal. If you're just thinking that just one development and that's it, when we open the Strait of Hormuz, everything is going to go back to the same conditions where we were before the war, that is pretty naive. And the first change, the major change that we have seen is, for example, we're already in a world where we have the UAE, which for all its history was a member of OPEC, and now it's not anymore a member of OPEC. And the UAE is not a was not a marginal producer in OPEC. It is a major producer. And yes, for OPEC, that membership has changed over time. So it's not something new, but you have a major producer leaving the organization. But for the UAE, it's a new chapter opening. And I'm sure that there will be other countries watching very closely how the UAE is going to do in this kind of new model for its economy, for its oil industry, and learn lessons and maybe copy it or maybe avoid it. We'll have to wait and see. So that is a fundamental difference between the pre-war level and where we are today in markets. Other differences, in any big crisis that world oil markets have experienced, and Professor Stevens gave us this nice development of the evolution of the oil industry, we rarely have seen a major crisis at this scale simply passing. It always creates some structural changes in the market, whether on the supply side or the demand side, or actually on both sides. And that's why the world post-war is unlikely to be back to the same world that we saw before the war. I'm just thinking about demand. Yes, we have demand destruction that is just behavioral because of high prices, but we also have seen structural destruction of demand, whereby demand does not look the same after a big crisis. So if you put all these factors together, and again, there are so many things that have happened in the context of the energy transition, you will see that really we should not talk about going back to normal. We should be really discussing the new normal post-crisis.
Okay, Dr. Carol, you just talked about the post-war era. So over the next decade, will organizations like OPEC continue to play a central strategic role in oil markets, or will bilateral and regional energy partnerships take precedence?
First of all, we talk about the regional side, because one of the things that perhaps we are observing closely after this crisis is whether we're going to see greater cooperation in the Middle East to achieve greater sense of energy security when it comes to protecting the infrastructure. Are we going to see perhaps better interconnection between energy infrastructure in each country so that the region as a whole is better equipped to face such dilemma or such a conflict in the future? So that's an important development that we are working closely, because I can say it here openly. I mean, when I look at the region with all its richness and wealth in oil and gas, but when I see the kind of collaboration between countries and neighbors, I don't see it commensurate with the wealth available, the natural resource wealth available in the region. When it comes to OPEC, well, really, it all depends on the discipline of the members and on the membership itself of OPEC, because OPEC is a group of countries that many of them sit on very, very abundant resources, but also they are low-cost producers. But in a world that is changing, as a world that is changing and moving and accelerating towards the energy transition, I want to say that is not enough anymore. We also have to see about the producer who has the lowest carbon intensity. While there are some members within OPEC that have very low carbon intensity, others are on the other extreme, on the other side of the spectrum. Now, they're assuming that there are no further major changes within OPEC. It's not just about the UAE that left OPEC. I'm thinking about the future of Venezuela, for example. If there is a greater American influence now on Venezuelan oil industry, will Venezuela be the next to leave OPEC? But let's leave that scenario aside. Let's assume that all the remaining members are going to stay together and we're going to see stronger discipline among members. Then I fear that there will be a period where OPEC is going to face stronger competition. But even in a shrinking market, in the longer term, the OPEC producers, especially those that are the low-cost producers with large reserves and low carbon intensity, are going to benefit from perhaps greater influence. But there will be a wobbly period, if you want, before OPEC reassert its important role in oil markets. But oil markets are not going to look the same.
Okay, that brings me to one final question to you, Dr. Carroll, because I know you will have to leave our meeting in a bit. As governments accelerate investments in renewable and energy security after recent geopolitical shocks, do you believe the global energy transition is genuinely reducing dependence on oil, especially the world is now producing, as I previously mentioned, 100 barrels of oils per day?
It's a very interesting question. Of course, the easy answer will say, oh, yes, the crisis will accelerate the energy transition. But we should remember that if you look at the last maybe 8 years, you feel like, or even 10 years, you feel like the kind of focus on the energy transition is more like a swinging pendulum, though I have to say it's an asymmetric pendulum swinging, because sometimes it goes from one extreme to the other, but then it takes time very slowly to go back and maybe not necessarily to the same angle. So we saw, for example, before or around 2021 or before the war in Ukraine, how the world was, I mean, the calls for a greener future where there is much less role for oil and gas, those kind of calls were pretty dominant and loud. Then the crisis in Europe hit with the war in Ukraine and the changes in governments around the world. And we saw that pendulum swinging in the opposite direction. I mean, if you look just at statements who are from the IEA or governments around the world, not just in the US, by the way, in many countries, they kind of ditched in many places the ambitious climate targets, the net zero targets, and companies saying that, you know what, we made a mistake, we're going to invest more in oil and gas. Now, today, the crisis may be forcing a recalibration of our energy policy, of our energy priorities. But ironically, I don't see a return to the pre-22 calls where people said, you know what, oil and gas are not reliable. We're going to move away from them and just focus on green energy, including nuclear. What I see today more than, especially if you compare it with pre-2022 calls, for example, I see a greater attention given to all sources of energy, not just to green versus oil and gas. I see more a call for investment across all sources of energy, but also in infrastructure as well. So that's one thing we are seeing today. Perhaps it is different from before. It does not mean a deceleration of the energy transition. It just means, for me, a reconfiguration of the energy transition, but we are still heading in the same direction. We did not really change direction. Actually, I don't think we changed direction entirely, but the focus has changed, but we are still heading in a more greener, conscious world.
I agree, Dr. Carol. Thank you so much. Let's go back to His Excellency Dr. Adnan. Doctor, are we witnessing a permanent realignment of Gulf energy interests? And could the UAE's decision signal the beginning of a broader fragmentation in which other high-capacity producers also prioritize bilateral interests over collective organization discipline?
Well, I would start answering your question by recalling what Paul said, that if there was no OPEC at this time or at any point in time, the world would have to invent an OPEC in order to stabilize the markets. That's the first thing I want to say. The second, also, I think Carol answered your question, and let me just state, is that you putting all of your eggs in one basket, whether it's renewable or oil and gas or nuclear, has been the case of people thinking that security is with this or that on that. And that doesn't work. What you really need to do is to have a policy, especially for large consumers, to have a policy of diversifying their sources and resources. What does that mean for OPEC and the bilateral, which was really your question? It means we will be living in a world that each major consuming country would be trying to achieve security not by one focus on one thing, whether it's oil or LNG gas or nuclear or renewable. I think the lessons has been learned that we should diversify to the extent possible. Sources, but also resources. Sources mean coming from Russia or coming from UAE or coming from where do you get your source of supply? Resources, what do you use, whether nuclear or renewable, what have you? So I don't see bilateral is everybody will swing to bilateral arrangement. That trend is happening, and UAE decided for their reason, calculation, and their own interest, and I have no doubt that contemplated that for a long time. The timing, as Carol said, was perfect when nobody is noticing much. Bilateral will continue, but if everybody focuses on bilateral, then everybody will leave OPEC. Then you will have to reinvent OPEC. And that's my point, which I started with. I don't think we will see a trend, all of the major producers leaving OPEC. I think there will be a core led by Saudi Arabia and maybe Kuwait, for sure, in my opinion, based on what I know about Kuwait. And there are other producers. Now, would Nigeria or Venezuela leave OPEC? Maybe, but the major producers will still have to have some kind of coordination. Remember, OPEC by itself found that it is necessary to have non-OPEC join them, and that's where we have OPEC Plus. And I wouldn't be surprised in a year or two, the Emirate became one of the OPEC Plus outside of OPEC. I'm not predicting that. It's not going to happen tomorrow or next year. But after some experimenting and learning by the United Arab Emirates and any other OPEC member that decides to leave, I think we will see coordination. And because, as everybody said, if the market is left without an organization that coordinate the production and to ensure stable market and reasonable good prices for the producer and consumers, there will be chaos. Nobody wants chaos. So that's really my concluding remark on your question. Yes, especially those who are anxious, especially those who have small reserves and want to cash in quickly, such as the shale producers or the U.S. The U.S. I just read on my screen now that China agreed to buy some more oil from United States. Let's remember the United States is not a major reserves country. So it will optimize on trying to find bilateral, whether it's China or India and so on and so forth. That was my answer to your question.
Thank you, Doctor. Since you mentioned China and India, um, they currently account for nearly 80% of the UAE's crude exports. How do you expect Abu Dhabi's energy relationship with Beijing and New Delhi to evolve from now on?
Well, no doubt in my mind that part of the reason why the UAE, and they have said that more or less, not necessarily explicitly, but is that they have expanded, they invested to expand their production capacity. Why did they expand their production capacity? Because they have an energy strategy that rely on maximizing their return on their investment and maximizing also their export not only of energy, but their export of products and services. And they have done very good in this, even including re-exporting. So for the UAE, currently within OPEC, they are unable to use all of their full production capacity, which is approaching 5 million barrels, and they are restricted to around 3.5 million barrels. I think they will be able to increase their supply to India and China on bilateral arrangement, whether it is going to be through crude or products or other downstream and other products of oil. That's of course, it's going to create some competition with OPEC, other OPEC members that are also looking at India and China and East, because most of the demand growth is coming from Asia, East Asia. That we all know that. Maybe Africa a little bit, but Africa has producers, many producers, not like the case of Asian countries. So I think that is going to define the relationship between OPEC members, led by Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, and the UAE Emirate, United Arab Emirates, in the next year or two. They will have to learn how to compete nicely. Just like, as I said, there's a divorce, but the divorce doesn't mean that you leave everything behind you. They have children, they have assets, and they have investments, and they have to learn how to live together after the divorce. And maybe they'll find a way to even coordinate ultimately. So in answer to your question, UAE will attempt to increase its export to India and China and other Eastern countries, but mainly India and China. But they have to manage it in terms of the competition in a nice way with other Gulf countries, major producers that have been looking strategically to increase their export also to the same markets.
With that note, Dr. Adnan, I would like to welcome Mr. Robin uh, to our dialogue here today. Mr. Robin, I want to move to you since, on Dr. Adnan's note, since the UAE's infrastructure can handle nearly 5 million barrels per day, was the decision to leave OPEC a reflection of the UAE's outgrowing the one-size-fits-all approach that was constraining its economic strategy, from your opinion?
Yes, thank you. So the UAE has been looking to think about its position within OPEC for actually a long time, and even going back to the early 2000s. So this is not, in a sense, a new development. Now, to take the final decision, obviously that's something else. and obviously the current timing around the influence of the war indeed helps kind of give the push to make such a momentous decision. But the idea of thinking about whether it benefits the UAE to continue within OPEC or to move on is not a new one. And not for other members either. Obviously, various members have been in and out at different times, and Qatar, of course, I think is the closest comparison, leaving in 2019. Now, the UAE has felt constrained by OPEC for several years, and I think this constraint's been particularly acute since 2016 and the formation of OPEC Plus, and then since 2020 and the post-COVID recovery period, in which, okay, in the COVID period, okay, yeah, very steep production cuts were required because demand had collapsed by 20 million barrels per day. So I don't think anybody would kind of argue that that was necessary. But I think in the post-COVID recovery period, there was a long stretch in which OPEC was very slow in increasing production, very cautious. And I think the UAE felt itself increasingly constrained. The UAE has more spare production capacity relative to its total than any other country. So it was disproportionately bearing the burden of OPEC cuts. Yes, it was allowed various increases in production quotas over time, but rather limited. So not surprising, I think the UAE got frustrated by that. The UAE, of course, has very large resources, as some other OPEC countries do. But the UAE also has very credible plans to increase production capacity. A large part of those plans already put into practice, and some more of them active today. And that's kind of distinguishes it from, for example, Libya or Venezuela or even Iraq, which certainly also have large resources but have a lot more problems turning that into production. So I think those are kind of important strategic drivers for the UAE to think again. And the UAE also has a different view of its own economy. Yes, oil is a very important part of the economy, but gas is a very important part. UAE gas production is growing. UAE wants to be self-sufficient in gas. Obviously, oil goes along with gas and vice versa. So restrictions on oil were hampering the UAE's gas growth plans. And the UAE also thinks of itself as moving increasingly to a post-oil economy where, yeah, oil remains important, but not the critical driver of the economy. And in which the UAE can live with much lower oil prices than most of its OPEC colleagues.
Okay, so do you see the UAE oil production is significantly lower carbon than that of many former OPEC colleagues? Can the UAE position its oil as a preferred transition barrel based on stronger ESG performance?
The UAE has certainly seen that as a competitive advantage for years now. Yes. So if you look at the ranking of oil producers by carbon intensity of production, then you have at the very lowest carbon ones, you have the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Norway, Denmark. Those four stand out. And then at the high end, you have other countries with much higher carbon intensities, either because their industries are not managed so well, they're flaring associated gas, or because of the nature of their oil, maybe their oil is heavy, or otherwise energy intensive to produce. So yes, I mean, we're in a climate constrained world. Since we still need oil to some degree, it's best that we use oil that is lowest carbon to produce preferentially. So that certainly is a competitive advantage to the UAE, and the UAE has put a lot of attention into continuing to lower the carbon intensity of production by particularly electrification of facilities, using nuclear and solar power to run facilities, starting on carbon capture and storage, although I think that there needs to be a lot more of that, needs to go quicker, but some efforts in carbon capture and storage. And then all other various other kind of initiatives to cut the carbon intensity of production.
Thank you, Mr. Robin. I want to go back to Professor Paul. You briefly gave us a background on this, but I want to know your opinion that by freeing itself from OPEC quotas, the UAE can prioritize volume over price now against the backdrop of declining global oil demand due to the EV adoption and electrification. Do you foresee other producers following its example?
I think the short answer is most definitely. If you're sitting on large reserves of oil, which a number of countries are, and you're looking at the energy transition, while it's true that oil will still be required for many activities for the long distant future, it's also true that those reserves are not going to be produced. I mean, if they are produced, then we're all going to be under 10 foot of water. And so the implication of that is it's going to be, and I think this is in part behind the UAE's decision to leave OPEC, is that they may as well try and produce it now while the oil market has the demand for it. Because the great danger is, as the energy transition speeds up, then the demand for oil is actually going to start falling. People are already talking about peak oil emerging in the next couple of years. And so there is a strong temptation there for countries to go their own way. And if that happens, then we're back to the 1920s, intense competition and lower prices. You talked earlier about the idea that OPEC might be replaced by regional bilateral agreements. But the thing to remember is that oil is an international market. And the only way you can control that market is with an organization that's large enough to cover sufficient of the market to be able to control it. If everyone's going to go into bilaterals, then, as I say, you're back down to the 1920s, price competition, very much lower prices.
Yeah. If we're talking about prices here, if global supply increases and oil markets rebalance at lower prices, could those cheaper oil prices slow the European energy transition by making it more competitive relative to the renewables, from your
Yeah,
opinion? Mhm.
that is a fair point. But
Yeah.
the thing you have to remember, and this is the new factor here, is that the events of the war have meant that energy security of supply is very much back up the agenda. The beauty of renewables is that they are domestic. They are not reliant. Once you've got the equipment in place, they're not reliant on external factors. And so you're likely to see lower oil prices, not necessarily increasing demand, because the policies of the consumer countries, and we're already seeing this in Europe, are designed to try and move away from oil. I mean, the shock of the closure of Hormuz has yet to be really understood, I think, and really felt.
Thank you, Professor. Now I want to give each of you one final question, and I want you to put all of your amazing insights into it. So starting with Dr. Adnan, Your Excellency, as the global energy systems become increasingly fragmented and security driven, how could OPEC and other producing countries adapt their strategies from market stability to resilience and long-term partnerships to remain relevant in a world defined by persistent uncertainty and uneven regional exposure?
Well, if the question is addressed to the producers, as I understood it,
Yeah.
then I think I go back to what I said in the beginning, is that the consumers or the importers, they would be, as was mentioned by my colleague, by Paul, and by others, they would be diversifying their sources and resources. So me as a producer, as an OPEC, what shall I do? There are fundamental facts, and Paul, I think, mentioned one fundamental fact, is that the energy transition will continue to proceed. And what does that mean? It will continue to proceed. We don't know exactly 10 years or 20 years from now what would be the level of oil consumption or oil production, but we know that the share of lower carbon energy will be higher. Now, that will come from various sources, including oil and gas that has been possibly decarbonized either at the production or at the consumption. So that's one important thing for us in the region, how to respond to this real question. I see the producers will do more of what the UAE has done in the last 20 years. What the UAE has done, and Saudi Arabia has started to do, and others are learning how to do, which is to go back to the drawing board and look, I have a huge asset that may lose value over a long period of time. I don't know for how long. So let me buy some insurance. How do I buy some insurance? I make sure that I will project myself as a producer and exporter of low carbon energy sources. Well, oil and gas has a high carbon content, so I start with eliminating the flaring, but I also work with others on technologies that would reduce the carbon footprint of my major supply. I'm not talking about renewable and nuclear. That's for domestic reasons. That's what the UAE has done, has invested heavily in nuclear and renewable. And that's what many of the consumers are doing. But as an exporter, and that's the bulk of your question, I will start working on technologies that make either the production of oil and gas or the consumption of oil and gas has less footprint, including direct air capture, carbon capture, including improving the efficiency. The second question, you also talked about it, which is very important, the resilience, because we are moving in the last 10 years or so, the focus has been on efficiency and cutting down costs to increase profit margin. But that's not sufficient. We don't know what will happen when the Hormuz Strait is opened, whenever that. We don't know exactly what happened. But what we need to do is to have a resilience. Resilience for the consumer, as I mentioned, is known. But what is resilience for me as a producer? As a major producer like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Iraq and Nigeria and Emirate, resilience for me is that I will have multiple ways of exporting my product. I have multiple ways of cleaning them up. I have multiple ways of ensuring markets competition, not just crude, products, fertilizer. So that's the diversification on the producer side. I will diversify what I am doing. I will have multiple insurance in order I remain resilient and dominant in the market. That would be really my advice, if I could say so. And I've already seen that in addition to the UAE, the Saudis are doing that, and they will accelerate that. I think the final point, I want to just take advantage of what you asked me to distill my thoughts. Robin mentioned correctly that the UAE felt that their percentage of their spare capacity to their total capacity has been probably the burden has been the largest over the last 10 years or so. And it's correct. But I think the other producers will point out that burden sharing or burden weight should not be measured subjectively by each member, should be looked at in totality. If you look at over the last 5 decades or 10 decades, if that can be used, you will see that the burden has fallen not on the UAE, but on perhaps Saudis or others. What does that mean, implying for the future? Implying it because I remember I was in the Secretary General, Acting Secretary General, Director of Research, and we were talking about quotas, the history of quotas. At one point in time, and Paul knows that, the history of quotas, there was a formula that was abandoned that was based on reserves, based on population, based on human development, based on so and so population size. And all of these things quantitatively were abandoned for a good reason, because you cannot take a formula and stick to it. So it became more as a negotiation. And my final point here is that everybody will do what the Emirate has done, we will have a problem that requires solution of the major producer having to sit down together and coordinate that, because Saudi Arabia may do exactly what the Emirate has done. Huge investment, taking their production capacity from 10 million barrels to 15 million barrels. I was in OPEC I was in OPEC, no, sorry. I was in OPEC when the Saudi Arabia was being asked desperately by the United States to invest more, to increase its production capacity to 50 million barrels a day. And Aramco drew up plans, but they did not implement them. So this issue of investing heavily by one producer will create a problem if you don't sit down around the table and coordinate it, whether you're a member of OPEC or outside OPEC. I'll close with this.
Thank you, Dr. Adnan. I'll move to you, Professor Paul. Do you envision a future in which global oil supply security and reliability increases or decreases?
My view is that the future will be dominated by concern about supply security, reinforced by recent events, and also concern about climate change as well. But I would just make one point to sort of conclude. Being a member of OPEC has always been painful because you're not producing at the level that you could produce at. And my fear is that as the demand for oil begins to decline, and it will do, that pain is going to become greater. And as the pain becomes greater, it's likely that more countries will leave OPEC. And you then get into a situation where you have lost control of the market, and that is just going to be chaotic with very low prices. And that is my concern. I come back to the point, and Dr. Adnan has reinforced this. If you didn't have OPEC, you would have to invent it, otherwise face much lower prices. And if you're facing much lower prices, what then are the prospects for so many oil producers that are so highly dependent upon oil revenues? Now, there's been a lot of talk about diversification, but if you look at the record of diversification, particularly in the Middle East, it's not been very good at all. There's been a lot of talk about it, but not a great deal has happened. And so from that point of view, I'm fairly pessimistic about the future, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Professor Paul. Mr. Robin, I want to know from your perspective, once the conflict ends, how will consumers be affected by higher expected volumes of UAE oil exports and potentially lower energy prices?
Are you mute?
So I think immediately after the crisis is over, let's say when free transit through the Gulf resumes, there'll be a big rush to produce and export and to refill storage. And that refilling of storage may take a substantial period. That may take a year, 18 months to get back to, let's say, normal storage levels, depending how much we've drained in the meantime. So prices are going to be relatively elevated through that period. Now, once we get through that period and we're back to something like a normal market, then indeed we have the potential for lower prices because we'll have possibly an global economic slowdown with the after effects of the war. No doubt a reduction in demand because of consumers adopting efficiencies and electric vehicles and all these kind of things, and probably also more non-OPEC supply, and let's say non-Gulf supply coming online over the slightly longer term. So we can expect, I think, lower prices anyway. Now, what impact then does the UAE decision have on that? Well, I think the UAE has made it clear that, and one of the reasons for the decision to leave is it kind of foresees this period after the war and is concerned that OPEC won't move quickly enough to increase production and normalize the market again. And it would indeed be dangerous, I think, for the oil producers to have a lengthy period in which they're very slow in restoring production and prices stay high, and we get all the demand destruction and so on that goes along with that. It makes sense to have a period in which there is higher production and accept some lower prices as we normalize. And the UAE will have the flexibility to do that. I mean, the UAE extra production it could bring onto market from the 3.4 million of its quota pre-war to the 5 million of capacity. So there could be another 1.6 million in theory. In practice, perhaps somewhat less than that. So that's a significant amount in the market. not an absolute game changer, but undoubtedly a significant amount that will reduce prices. Will the impact be more than that? That really depends on what the rest of OPEC does, as Dr. Adnan and Professor Paul have expressed. Is Venezuela going to increase production significantly over the next few years? Are other countries going to leave OPEC and try to increase their production? Are we going to get into this kind of free-for-all and price wars? And then after a few years, everybody regrets it and comes together again to some kind of agreement to restrict production? Or is OPEC going to hold together reasonably well, just with the exception of the UAE? Maybe the UAE will even collaborate informally, and maybe the market will be relatively much more managed and prices therefore not much different. So, of course, some quite different pathways. But I think on the whole, the UAE decision, yes, clearly points towards other things being equal to lower prices for consumers.
Thank you, Mr. Robin. And once again, I would like to extend my gratitude to all of the speakers today. As an economic researcher myself, I really enjoyed this dialogue. Thank you, Your Excellency, Dr. Adnan Shahabuddin. Thank you, Dr. Carol Nakhle. Thank you, Professor Paul Stevens. And thank you, Mr. Robin Mills. I'll move to the closing remarks now with my colleague, Sultan Al-Husani.
Assalamu alaikum, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. As we conclude this in-depth intellectual discussion on energy, OPEC, and the future of the global energy order, we must acknowledge that we are facing a defining moment, not only for energy markets, but for the organization itself, which has long been viewed as the collective voice of producing countries. It is a moment that demands a candid and critical assessment, away from diplomatic courtesies and rhetorical enthusiasm. So with the withdrawal of the United Arab Emirates from OPEC is neither a passing event nor a mere technical adjustment related to production quotas. It represents a clear strategic signal that one of the world's leading energy producers with significant refining capacity and global clean energy investments has concluded that OPEC's institutional framework no longer aligns with its ambitions, nor reflects its evolving role in the global energy system. This alone warrants a reassessment of the assumptions upon which the organization was built. As highlighted through this dialogue, OPEC is facing structural challenges that extend beyond technical adjustments, operating in a fundamentally different environment shaped by technological transformation, climate pressures, and increasingly divergent member interests. Its decision-making has become more constrained, often reflecting compromise rather than genuine strategic alignment. So perhaps the most significant challenges can be summarized in 5 key areas. First, a decision-making process shaped by fragile internal political balances, resulting in recurring disputes, quota violations, and weakened collective discipline. Secondly, the absence of a coherent vision for the post-hydrocarbon era, with the discourse oscillating between acknowledging the inevitability of energy transition and defending the existing model. Thirdly, the expansion of the OPEC Plus framework has introduced greater complexity as geopolitical tensions increasingly intersect with economic priorities, undermining cohesion and effectiveness. Fourth, the OPEC Plus structure has imposed constraints on member states, investment strategies, and long-term development ambitions, raising concerns about the balance between coordination and national flexibility. And fifth and finally, the absence of a meaningful reform agenda suggests that the organization is managing short-term challenges rather than a long-term structural transformation. So in this context, the central question is no longer how OPEC can recognize itself, but whether it, if it can continue to play a meaningful role in the emerging global energy order, or whether new and more flexible frameworks for coordination will be required. So this brings us to the deeper challenge facing producing nations, including those still within the organization, is to avoid the trap of merely managing a declining present while the future is being shaped elsewhere, beyond their decision-making tables. So if the UAE's withdrawal carries a broader lesson, it is that strategic independence and decisiveness may prove more effective than continued membership in an institution increasingly unable to adapt to the transformations of its era. So I'd like to conclude by saying thank you all. And we look forward to more future intellectual engagements marked by the same depth, clarity, and strategic insight. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Sultan. And thank you again to all of our speakers. It was a delightful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure, Your Excellency, Professor Paul, and Sir Robin Mills. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.